Hello, everybody, and welcome to the latest edition of the Pulse with BP. I'm your host, Billy Parvatam, folks. I'm so excited today to be joined by the voice of my alma mater, none other than Jon Laaser, the voice of the Hokies. He's director of broadcasting operations at Virginia Tech. He's a former broadcaster at VCU and a couple of other colleges, while also a longtime broadcaster in minor league baseball. Jon, thanks so much for joining me today.
Absolutely, Billy. Glad to be with you.
For sure. Well, I want to start off with first, how have you been handling this pandemic? I mean, for all of us, this coronavirus has impacted our lives both professionally and personally. So, how has it impacted yours? I know, especially early on, it kind of canceled a lot of games you were supposed to do in March and April and the spring.
Yeah, I'd be lying if I said it wasn't disruptive. Certainly, particularly in March, it kind of hit at a time, not kind of, it literally hit at a time where we had wrapped up the season. The Hokies lost the North Carolina ACC tournament. Don't think that they were going to be participating in any postseason. Pretty sure of that. Actually, I was ready to kind of go into vacation mode, which is the way it works in our business. You kind of go full bore for 9 months, and then you get three, like a school teacher, to kind of reset and recharge. Well, instead of that, of course, we got instead a situation where there were furloughs within our company, Learfield IMG College. So rather than booking trips and going to weddings, which was our plan, instead of that, wound up trying to figure out unemployment online and scrambling for some of those things. But ultimately, it was also an opportunity to spend a lot more time with my wife, just be home, be in Blacksburg, enjoy that, get to hang out with a couple people at a time, whichever was allowed, and really reset and recharge regardless. And then when I came off furlough in July, I kind of took the pandemic as a challenge. You know me, Billy, I'm very competitive and everything that I do. And I said, we're all going to go through this, meaning all the broadcast crews in the ACC in the country. And if we're going to do that, I want to do it better than them. And I really, as we sit here today, feel like we did. I feel like we prepared very well. I feel like we prepared very realistically. And I think our listeners would tell you throughout the course of football and now into basketball season that our product hasn't really sounded any different than it's done in the past, save for the lack of crowd noise at times. So I take a lot of pride in that. And I think through all of it, it's made us tougher. It's made us stronger. And it's made us more appreciative of some of the things that we thought were certainties in the past, like our salaries and our roles.
That's definitely nice to hear. I want to go back, Lays, to more happier times, to your time with the St. Cloud River Bats in the Northwoods League. I was especially interested to hear about that because I also worked in the Northwoods League with the lacrosse loggers. I mean, what do you remember about that experience working in St. Cloud?
Well, you mentioned the Loggers. I'm so long ago there in 2003 and 4. I remember when the Loggers opened up their stadium. We were the first opponent that went in there with St. Cloud. Now, I remember that, Billy, as two of the most fun and most rewarding summers of my life. And really, the first one was because it was the first time that someone had said, here's a microphone and you're our guy. And the reception was good because before that, going in, we all don't know if we're any good, right? Before we get on the air, we think we are. We're biased. I'm sure listening back to the tapes, I wouldn't think they sounded good, but that was the first time that I realistically thought I might have a chance to do this for an actual living, for a career. And it was also the first time traveling with a group of elite athletes and learning how to develop relationships with them and being very young at the time. Some of the other things I remember was just how insane it was in Madison, just 10,000 hanging out over the walls, and some of the fun times we had, on the road with younger people like myself at the time. And a lot of those have been life-lasting relationships for me that I continue now. And it was just really gratifying. But I always say this when people ask about the Riverbats, I always say, you've been in this business and you're pretty old when you have not one, but two teams that have either changed names or are defunct. And the Riverbats are no more. It's now the St. Cloud Rocks. They switched ballparks. And then a team I worked for a couple notches later in my career, the Yakima Bears, are no longer. They're defunct, and they moved to outside Portland, Oregon, and are the Hillsboro Hops. So I can't even go back and visit some of my old stomping ground.
Well, that's what I want to ask you next is, you worked in minor league baseball for a long time. You mentioned Yakima. You were in Montgomery, Alabama, Richmond for a long time. I mean, what is it like for the average fan that doesn't know to work in the minor leagues?
You got to work. That's the thing. It's a very underfunded business. I think minor league baseball is at the top of the list in terms of taking something small in terms of your revenue for a lot of the teams, but also your resources, and making it look big. And I think that people that work in minor league baseball, we used to always say it's not a job, it's a lifestyle. And that was absolutely true. And it certainly was not for everybody. Like I said earlier there, I'm very competitive. So I wanted to be better than everybody at everything. That maybe wasn't going to help me transition into higher levels of broadcasting. But when I designed a pocket schedule, I wanted it to be the best. When I designed a calendar, I wanted it to be the best. I didn't really care about being the best on the tarp crew, but I wanted to be proficient. I didn't want to be the weak link out there. And we all knew who those were. But it meant, early mornings. I worked for Todd Parnell for a lot of those years that you mentioned. Awesome dude. His mantra is work hard, play hard. We did both. And that would have me at the ballpark at 8 a.m. And in his office, maybe having an adult beverage or two until 2 a.m. And we would repeat that process for 7 days at a time on homestands, and then hit the road for hours-long bus trips and some of those things. So, it was definitely an experience in which you learned so much. I went into it having no idea what Adobe was, and coming out of it pretty much a studio-level designer on InDesign and Photoshop and Illustrator and all of those things. I was the media coordinator. I knew how to write press releases. A lot of things that maybe people learn in college, I was actually learning live on the job. And ultimately, it was a lot of fun. I think it turned me into a person that can get along with the top and bottom in terms of, the country club set, but also the rural folks in a lot of those towns, and really enjoy all of those different types of people. And that has certainly served me well here.
What's the craziest story or the safest story you can share during your time in the minor leagues? I mean, I talk to guys all the time, and they say that's the best stories in the minor leagues. So is there one or maybe one or two that you remember that, man, stand out from your time in minor league baseball?
With St. Cloud. And I mentioned earlier, we went into Madison. We never won in Madison because our guys enjoyed the scenery and nightlife in Madison a little too much before the games. We were the best team in the league at the time, but we just couldn't win there. So they were giving away these trucker Madison Muskies hats to the fans, and they gave them to our guys. These were like the plastic snapback hats. The Muskies were a team from years before, the Mallards there in Madison, and that was kind of their promotion for the night. Well, we lost, of course, and the guys were all wearing the hats on the bus, kind of joking because we went to Mankato for the next stop on our road trip. And Mankato had this wooden party deck right to the left of our third base dugout. And our manager, a guy by the name of Tom Fleenor at the time, he was also the head coach at USC at the time, Spartanburg. Now it's USC Upstate. He said, guys, get those hats. I don't want to see those hats. We're going to do away with the hats, because he thought they were cursing us. Didn't want anything to do with Madison. So he took them and put them in one of those hard wax trash cans that you see at ballparks, put them in there, somehow got lighter fluid from one of the concession grills, poured it in there and lit it up. And he didn't realize that a fire in that would melt the trash can and spread. It wasn't a metal trash can that would condense it. So all of a sudden, the party deck is just engulfed in flames. And they get it out, and they finally get it out, but the party deck has about $2,000 worth of damage. They can't use it for the game. It's a picture of it in flames on the front page of the paper the next morning. And Fleenor, who was the one that lit it on fire and was definitely the guilty party, didn't want to take blame. So his quote was, well, if there wasn't so much effing lacquer on that deck, this wouldn't have happened. And I think ultimately St. Cloud ownership had to go back and pay that one for him.
Man, that sounds like straight out of a movie, the way you're where you're telling that. I was wondering, how did this opportunity with Virginia Tech come up? I mean, I've read some about it. I mean, you were in a hotel room in Portland, Maine, and had to do an interview, and then you got the call at a minor league game. I mean, how did all of this kind of come up for you to come to the Hokies?
Yeah, I think like a lot of things in life, it's such a layered process that at times you don't even know is happening, right? When I was in Richmond, we took on a local owner because most of our owners were from New York or the Northeast. And we didn't think that was the best look coming down to Richmond, Virginia, which is, of course, the former capital of the South. And we brought on a local owner by the name of Brian Callahan, who is a very prominent tech grad and donor, was one of three to start a company called Apex Systems that went on to just blow up into this huge company that they later sold a few years after I met Brian for $640 million. So, he's got his name on the locker room. Apex and his friends are well known, and he was very close to Whit Babcock. So I was sitting in the radio booth at the Diamond actually in April when I saw the news story, like everybody else did, that Bill was leaving. And I knew Bill a little bit at the time. So I called him after the game and said, I don't know if I have any realistic chance at this, but what do you think? And he was very supportive and encouraging and said, yeah, why not? You're well known in Virginia, throw your hat in the ring, see what happens. So I did that. Brian reached out directly to Whit on my behalf. I think he kind of got my application to the top of the pile where they looked at it and became part of the process. It went from there to a Skype interview, which Whit told me later I did exceptionally well on. And then they ultimately brought two candidates here, me and Chris Blair. I didn't know that at the time. I do now. And then Chris took himself out of the running because he's the voice now of LSU, which is more where he's from. So it worked out for everybody. Chris is the voice of the Tigers. I'm the voice of the Hokies. There's a lot more layers to that story, but I won't bore you with them.
That's definitely awesome to hear. So I have to ask you, how was that first game like against Ohio State? I mean, you get hired by the Hokies, then right out of the gates, you have to call a game with the defending champion at home Monday night, Frank Beamer against Urban Meyer. I mean, what was that experience like to call that Ohio State game as the first game in your Virginia Tech career?
It was a mess, Billy. It really was. You know me well enough to know that I don't worry about play-by-play. I never worry about what I'm going to say or being prepared. Those are always givens. I think for broadcasters that have been in it as long as I have, you can't be in it if you don't have that confidence in yourself. So I wasn't nervous about that. Like everybody thought I was, but I was really nervous about the technical aspect because of course, we have 40 affiliates. If you're off the air, there are a lot of people that know you're off the air and having trouble. And Bill had always been his own engineer. It was kind of a simpler operation than before I got here. They didn't have a sideline reporter, and I was going to bring Andrew Allegretti into that role because I thought he'd be great at it. And it turned out I was right, and he was. But that was just another element, another microphone, another thing. And we added another couple of other technical elements. So I had asked Learfield, or it was IMG at the time, Chris Ferris, my boss, the vice president, I said, look, like I have no trouble being the engineer going forward like Bill was, but for this first game, I really don't want to think about it. Would you mind sending up somebody from Winston-Salem where they were based? Sure, we'll send you our best. A guy by the name of Ben Blevins, who does a ton of national stuff and is a great guy. You probably know him, does the Carolina Panthers. And anyway, so he's coming up. And I'm like, all right, great. I don't worry about it. Right up until the morning of game day. My parents are here. My then girlfriend, now my wife, is here. I've been told that I was hard to be around for a number of days before that because I was wound very tight. But then I get a call from Blevins in the morning that says, hey, I'm not coming up, but Chris Ferris is going to come up. Well, Chris had ascended from an engineering role, which he held about 20 years prior, all the way to becoming the top guy in the audio department. So he kind of knew how to engineer, but not really. And also, you really don't want the guy who hired you standing right to your left while you're calling your first game in that role. And I had no familiarity with Mike or my spotter or my statistician, all people that are tremendous friends now, but weren't at the time. So there was a lot of stress. And then, of course, we were using some busted up wireless mic that we've since replaced a couple times over. It fails in the first quarter. The Hokies go down 14-0 in the blink of an eye. It winds up really not going well. I'm getting texts all night. You sound good. You sound terrible. You sound great. Eventually I had to put my phone away for the game, something I don't usually do. Then the Hokies come back. It's looking good. They're leading at the half. And then Michael Brewer, who's one of my favorite people, breaks his collarbone early in the third quarter, and Ohio State pulls away. But ultimately I heard from people that, we sounded good. We didn't sound like we were nervous. We didn't sound really out of place. I think it sounded different, of course, because it wasn't Bill after nearly 30 years. But ultimately, I remember it as a positive experience. I remember how proud my parents were just strutting around the streets of Blacksburg and telling anyone, primarily people that didn't want to hear it, that their son was the voice of the Hokies. And it was inebriated college kids who couldn't care less who the voice of the Hokies was. Ultimately, why not just throw everything at you at once? And I will say the drop off from Ohio State to Furman the next week was dramatic. Week one, I'm talking to game day, and I was prepping Jason Sehorn, who I used to, of course, admire as a DB for the Giants. And then the next week, no one cared. No one wanted to talk to us. Game was like digital only, and the bottom fell out. And then we kind of got our feet under us the rest of the year.
Man, that's certainly a heck of a story surrounding your first game. And, your first year was also Coach Beamer's last year. So do you have a good Coach Beamer story you can share in terms of how you got to know him? And how glad are you that you got an opportunity to at least experience 1 year of Coach Beamer before he retired?
Yeah, I think Coach Beamer retiring that year was perfect timing for me in a number of ways because, first and foremost, Coach was involved in the search, in the hiring process. That was a part of the story I left out, was interviewing with him and Buzz Williams at the time during my in-person visit here to Blacksburg, and got to know him a little bit there. But it also gave me tremendous confidence because I knew that he would have had to sign off on the hire, if that makes any sense. So he had, at least not knowing me all that well, some confidence in my ability to follow Bill, and that gave me a lot of confidence. And Bud Foster being here was huge too. I remember walking out to my first practice, and I had no idea where I was allowed to go. The last football job I had was Charleston Southern, and they were really restrictive in terms of stand here, don't stand there, and all of these things. I soon figured out that Coach Beamer's practices were more like a session in the park. You could bring your dog, you could walk them in the backfield. It didn't really matter. Everybody was welcome. And I'm kind of tentatively walking around, and Bud Foster shouts over to me. He says, "Hey, new guy, you can't see anything from there. Come out here with me." So I'm like literally in the defensive huddle in one of the camp practices, just terrified and all of those things. But I always remember how kindly Coach Beamer treated me. He never treated me like I didn't belong there, or, he was disappointed that Bill wasn't there still, which I'm sure he was because they're such great friends and have been for so long. But I never felt that from him. And I always say, if I hadn't have gotten that year with him, I wouldn't have truly understood the history of Virginia Tech football. I could have read about it, but I wouldn't have known how he treated his players. I wouldn't have known how he treated Mike and me and our crew and all of those things. So when he announced his retirement, it was just one of those things. Like I said, we thought we had everything transition away from an era, from a man who means and continues to mean so much to so many in this area. And it's one of those things in life that worked out. I think I was the perfect person to be here at that time because my role became less play-by-play announcer and more therapist. Not necessarily on the air, but in talking to people before Tech Talk Live. Parents are both psychologists, and kind of, I like to say I have an honorary degree in psychology, even though I never went to school for it. But Tech Talk Live, the day he did the press conference after we got back from Boston College, obviously the first half of the show that night, we talked about why it was the time to step away, what had gone into the decision, all of those things. He had been through the media gambit that day doing the press conference and ESPN, the car wash, we call it, and all those things. And he was clearly just exhausted about halfway through, not physically, but just mentally with the whole thing. And we went to break at about the midway point, and I turned to him and I said, "Hey, Coach, it's not over yet. So how about we be done with this retirement stuff for tonight, and let's talk about how we're going to beat whoever it was that we were playing the next week." And he put his hand on my knee and he said, "You're a good man."
That's definitely a great story from Coach Beamer. And then, like you mentioned, you got to cover Buzz Williams for a few years, and I saw every week that relationship you guys had on Tech Talk Live. It certainly was very fun to watch. I mean, what was it like to cover Buzz Williams? And do you have a story you could share about him? Because he's also quite a personality in and of himself.
Yeah, again, I'll go back to the interview process. I knew of Buzz Williams. Obviously, he was a very high-profile coach when he was at Marquette, and then when he came here, and I had seen some interviews, and I had certainly done some research on his personality. Things that you always are going to do when you go into a job interview. But nothing could have prepared me for Buzz Williams, and for whatever reason, I don't remember why. But I started that day with Mike Burnup, and we just talked. And I don't think Mike was supposed to come with me the rest of my stops. Like, I think that's supposed to be it. But it kind of was a precursor to our relationship now, where we're just always together. If we're having beers, we're doing it together. If we're eating, we're doing it together. And he just came with me to every one of my stops that day. And there were like 8. And eventually we picked up Steve Rockefort, who in his own right is such a fascinating personality. Coach Rock, as he was known around here, now down at ECU. And he grabbed me and he said, "Look, let me tell you something, kid." He goes, "Coach likes you because you're a basketball guy." And, that was because, of course, my most recent experience had been at VCU and calling a lot of levels of basketball before that. And the concern was, of course, Virginia Tech is a predominant football school, and this was before the NCAA tournaments and before all the success that he eventually had resurrecting the Hokies program. He goes, I want you to know this is going to be unlike any 30 minutes you've ever spent in your life. Coach is crazy. Those are his exact words. I'm like, all right. So I went in there and I didn't know enough to be scared of him like I was later. Everybody is a little bit uneasy. And I want to add the precursor to that, we're great friends now. And, I've came to love the guy. I came to love how he challenged you in the ways that he did it. And not just in broadcasting, but, you can see I'm wearing a sweatshirt right now. It's because I just got back from the basketball weight room. That was something that started with him and continued. But anyway, back to that interview session. He walks in, he doesn't introduce himself to me, doesn't say anything. He's in practice attire. He'd just come up from the floor. I think they had camp going on at the time. And he goes, "What are the last 2 books you read?" And fortunately, again, my girlfriend at the time, my wife now, had just given me The Secret, which is kind of a motivational book and about proper mental thinking and preparation and putting good things out into the world. And he loved that. Immediately, he loved that. And my mom had also sent me this other book about a baseball player who had gotten injured. He blew out his arm, needed Tommy John, and all these things, was down on his luck. And it was a religious book in terms of his comeback path to eventually the major league. So those were the 2 that I actually were reading at the time on the bus. And he just loved them both. So we just get into this long conversation about those books. We never wound up talking about the job whatsoever until about the last 2 minutes. And he said, "What did you think about the way VCU treated Shaka Smart?" Because Shaka had just left for Texas. And I said, "I think VCU put way too much into the branding of one coach that they probably knew was eventually going to leave with Havoc." And he said, "That's the smartest thing I've heard about the situation in a long time. Get out." Told me to get out of his office. So me and Mikey and Rock walk out, and Rock goes, "That was amazing, man." He goes, "I've never seen anybody handle Buzz Williams like that." And I was like, "I didn't handle anything. I didn't know enough to recoil. I was just kind of answering his rapid fire questions as honestly as I could." But I've got so many through the years of his kindness, of at times his shrewdness. He's just such an interesting guy. But the things that I take away, my wife still has a pair of sweet Nikes that he gave her for Christmas. He always included them in all the things that we did. I remember my mom is a huge Hokies basketball fan. It was her birthday. And I was FaceTiming her from the hotel, and Buzz walked by and he's like, "Liz, what are you doing?" And I'm like, "I'm talking to my mom." And he grabbed the phone. He goes, "I want to talk to your mom." And then he goes off. And the next thing I know, he's talking to her for 3 minutes. So, I miss him. There was always a high energy around him, which is why I'm so happy Coach Young's here now, because, he's completely different personality wise, but also really high energy and fun to be around.
That's awesome. I was wondering, what is your favorite football stadium to travel to? I mean, you've been to all of them in the ACC and a couple of them outside of the conference. Is there one that stands out to you?
Well, I'll be honest with you. The ones that stand out to you are the ones that are bad, because the ones that are good, you can go in and it's easy to set up technically and things sound crisp and they sound good. So the NFL stadiums are all obviously at a higher standard because the NFL mandates that, and you got backups for backups on lines and all those things. So Heinz Field is always an easy broadcast. Hard Rock always was, until they moved the booth into the corner and sealed it with glass that doesn't open and you can't see the game, basically. So that went from good to bad. There's honestly more bad stadiums in the ACC than there are good. Boston College is not nice. I don't like Scott Stadium, of course, being a Hokie. Georgia Tech is cool, particularly if you get a nice weather day looking out at the skyline of Atlanta. I love that. I love that view. Florida State was all right, although I don't think we got the full experience because the Hokies dominated in that game and there really wasn't a lot of opportunity to experience that crowd getting into the game. Notre Dame Stadium was a bucket list one, and we've gone there twice now, which was very cool. Once pre-renovation, once post-renovation. So I really enjoyed that. And a lot of times it's just the magnitude of the game, right? Like Camping World Stadium in Orlando, it's really not that nice, but we played the ACC championship game there. So I remember that one. But the one that sticks out is ECU. I hate that place. I've heard they've renovated it. I don't care. Sometimes, not to be conceited, but we travel 7 people. And in the Power 5, the booths are always big enough where you can fit everybody because everybody travels 7 people. Well, at that level, they don't. And Our booth was about the width of this table. Mike, we were touching like as we're standing there. I don't even know where our spotter and engineer wound up being. There was a beam that was to my right. I couldn't see. They were wearing purple numbers on black shirts, black uniform tops. It was just a disaster the first time we were there. Second time we moved up to the roof of the press box to have more space, but that meant we had to run about 500 feet of coax cable and also Cat 45, which we call it, and all of these things. But both times we got the broadcast on the air. ODU is a whole nother story of disaster. So I flipped that question on you. There's more bad ones than good ones, though, and especially in football for some reason.
For sure. Well, what do you remember about the Battle of Bristol? I mean, that is a unique experience of itself. I mean, the NASCAR Speedway and 100,000 people, Virginia Tech, Tennessee. I mean, I'm sure that's got to stand out to you in terms of your Virginia Tech career.
Yeah, I've got PTSD from that one, buddy. I really do. I remember how hard it was to get on the air. And I don't just mean that game day or game weekend. That started months before. And just dealing with the staff at Bristol, I've never in my life made multiple site visits. I've made, a site visit just to see a place before game day. Generally on the road, we'll go in the day before, even if it's a place we've been, just to make sure that nothing, has gone wrong. Well, at Bristol, we go there and we're doing a site visit, and they show us what is supposed to be our first booth. This is where Virginia Tech's going to be. And I look at it once and I was like, no, like this doesn't work. Like, it's not me being a jerk. This just doesn't work. It was recessed 3 levels. So there would have been 3 windows between us. If you can imagine, that window behind me is actually the window of the field. There being 2 other rooms in front of us. Also, it was way too small. And also it was not wired for the things that we needed. So I left there. I had Andrew Algretta with me. And he said, dude, like, that's not going to work. And I go, what would have Bill done? He goes, he would have gone ballistic until we got what we wanted. And I go, well, that's what I'm going to do. I'm just not going to do it today, because this was in like June, or maybe even before that, maybe like May. And the game wasn't for months. So I'm like, all right, we got time to work on this. And also what ticked us off was they showed us Tennessee's booth, and Tennessee's booth was glorious. They had like this whole luxury suite. I'm like, wait a minute, like, what the hell's going on here? So I get in touch with people. I'm like, look, this isn't going to work. And the thing about Bristol is they got a huge staff for an event like that. So I was kind of bouncing around. I didn't really know who was responsible for what and this, but I finally found this guy, and I can't remember his name, and I wish I could, because he was awesome. And I was like, look, like, here's bottom line. Like, here's what we need. And he's like, well, we don't have that, but I'm going to make it happen. And I'm like, okay. So long story short, they took one of the TV booths and built a wall through the middle of it to create another booth for us. So I like to say I'm the only announcer in college football history that got a booth built for one game. And we get in there, and sure enough, it's this wall, it's out of plywood, and it's spray painted black, but whatever, it works. We can fit our guys in there. We're staggered up 3 levels. And I'll also remember, we do our post-game interviews through dry pair connections, which are usually already pre-run at stadiums, and you just plug in and play with your gear at the bottom and your gear at the top. Not always an exact science, but generally there's some level of plan in place. Well, they clearly didn't have that. And Bristol is massive. And also our locker room was a tire garage, if you remember. It wasn't a locker room, it was a converted tire garage. But on top of that, Coach Fuente was going to do his post-game on the entire other end of the field in the media center there, which was over by Tennessee's locker room. So I get a hold of the phone guy. Phone companies have to run these lines. They're essentially glorified phone lines, these dry pairs. And I'm like, look, I have no faith this is going to work. And he's like, I'm going to make it work for you. He's like, it's not going to be easy, but I'm going to make it work for you. I'm like, okay. So I go down there, I meet with this guy. Turns out to be nicest Southern gentleman ever, a little bit older. He's got an assistant with him. And he's like, well, here's the thing. We're going to have to ping this off about 5 different stations throughout to get it down there. And I'm like, okay, well, I don't know where we're going to do post game. So we need 2. I need 1 into this closet in this tire barn, and I need 1 in the actual media center. So this takes like 3 days. My engineer and I went down on Wednesday, I think it was, And 3 days we're working on this. And it was finally like eureka when it finally worked, where it's like, oh my God, I can hear you. You can hear me. So that worked out. I still exchange like occasional emails with the guy because we became so close, the guy from the phone company, because we were together for so many days in a row. But then ultimately the Hokies lose the game, 5 fumbles. Fuente is seething. It's just a second game. I don't really know how he's going to react to adversity, negativity, right? I knew how Coach Beamer would. He was going to be a gentleman and it was going to be easy, and Bud Foster was the same way. And so what I'll always take away from that game was it starts raining after the game, and also Tennessee's out there with Butch Jones and they're celebrating like it's a bowl win because it was such a big game. And we're driving down because back then we had to do a post-game TV hit as well for Virginia Tech Sports Today. And Tim Wright, our producer and cameraman, was down on the other end. So Fu and I are riding in a golf cart, and I don't know what to say to him, right? I can just tell he's so angry, not at me, at his team for fumbling 5 times. And we get down there, and Tim was one of those guys where he says things at times where he shouldn't sometimes, right? Not because he's a bad guy, just because he can't help himself. And he says, "I'm sorry, Coach." And Coach said, he was apologizing about the rain because we're standing out in the rain to do this. And Fu goes, "I don't see how that's your fault." And Tim goes, "Well, I meant the rain." He goes, "But I'm sorry about the game too." And Fu goes, "That's even less your fault." And kind of laughed. And I never worried about what he was going to be like post game after that. And that was my biggest takeaway. But I always say this about that game: awesome to be a part of. A lot of good stories that came out of it. And I never, ever, ever want to do it again.
For sure. And Lays, you've been so gracious with your time, and I wanted to ask you one final question. Where do you see yourself in 10 years? I mean, you have been at Virginia Tech now 6 years, which is hard to believe. I mean, time flies. But, you did a lot of baseball prior to Virginia Tech. Is that something you want to do, maybe pursue down the road, an MLB broadcaster role? Are you happy at Virginia Tech? Do you hope you're here the next 30 years like Bill was? Do you have any idea where you want to be in 10 years, 2030?
I used to answer that question so definitively, right? Like, I want to be the voice of the Cubs. I want to live in Chicago. I want to do all these different things. And I've gotten to the point, I'm not an overly religious person, but I've realized how stupid it is to try to say that, particularly in this business, particularly with recent events. Who knew that we were going to go through a pandemic? Who knew that we were going to be fighting some of these other battles that we're fighting in our country right now? 15 years ago, I didn't know anything about Virginia Tech other than Michael Vick. Like most people nationally, I hadn't lived in Virginia. I didn't realize I'd spend 11 years here. I didn't realize I'd meet my wife in Richmond, and she'd move here with Blacksburg. So it's a long way of saying I have no earthly idea. I hope that I'm somewhere happy with my wife and we have a family, and she's as satisfied in her life and rewarded as I am, which honestly at this point is difficult because Blacksburg's just not a big market, and her industry is more big market driven. So if they'll have me, I'd love to be the voice of the Hokies forever. But I'm not at this point naive enough to say that that's set in stone by any means, because so many things could happen. And clearly, if there's a baseball opportunity that comes along and makes sense, and I can maybe pair that with football and basketball, then I would love to take that on. Again, if and when I'm fortunate enough to get it.
For sure. Well, John, this has been such a pleasure. Thank you so much for joining me. It's always nice to catch up with you.
Absolutely, Billy. I love you. Thanks, man.
Appreciate it. That's Jon Laaser, the voice of the Hokies, Director of Broadcast Operations, a seasoned broadcaster. This has been the latest edition of The Pulse with BP. Thank you so much, folks, and we'll see you next time.